He was a wonderful person, a superb scientist, and absolutely dedicated to serve science. To get the colloquium going, we are now going to have some introductory remarks by Victoria Stodden, one of the organizers. Come on up here.
Thank you, Richard, and the other organizers. And thank you, Robert, for a very sensitive discussion of Steve Feinberg. I'll just make one quick comment based on some of what you said, which is he also did personally reach out to me and mentor me to some degree. My PhD is in statistics, and that was the beginning of my relationship with Steve. And some of those discussions that we had are still ongoing as projects, including this one, for example. So I echo the comments that I'm sure he's in some sense still here and paying attention. It's not there. I can see it on the background desktop. Yeah. I don't know if that's on the if you look on the desktop. I don't know if that's it. I hope it's it. It's not what I named it. Okay, that looks like it. Not that. Okay, well, I'll just take a couple of moments to indicate what my purpose is in addressing you this morning. As Marcia alluded to, and we've actually heard a couple of comments, that reproducibility is not something that has a clear and easy definition, and even if we did, sort of put our minds together and come up with a definition, it certainly wouldn't be universally accepted. It's one of those concepts that if I asked each of you what you understood reproducibility in scientific research to be, I'm pretty sure you would give me all slightly different nuanced answers depending on your background, how you understand research to be carried out, what problems you might be addressing. And so one of the reasons we wanted to put a very short discussion about the issues around reproducibility, even including touching on terminology at the beginning of this discussion, is because it can bring greater clarity to our discussion to sort of have, in a sense, a framing about the concepts that we're discussing throughout the next couple of days. So I don't know if this is, okay, there we go. Okay, so I have been in a number of discussions around reproducibility in a number of different fields. It's very clear to me that one size does not fit all in terms of solutions and in terms of proposed remedies for a number of different reasons. So what I'd like to do and what I have found productive in discussions like this is try to tease out some different ways that people think about reproducibility. Three that I have found useful is I've just called them empirical reproducibility, statistical reproducibility, and computational reproducibility. I think it's important because we bring our own views of how reproducibility interacts with our work, what it means to do reproducible science and research, and also it touches on not just framing the problem, but how we actually start to frame remedies or discuss what may be issues that need attention or don't need attention, and how we actually move forward towards that robust culture that Marcia mentioned around scientific discovery. So empirical reproducibility, I have a little bit on each one. Essentially, let me jump to empirical reproducibility. Essentially, empirical reproducibility, the way that I think about this is our more traditional notions of reproducibility. So even if we go back to when the concept was introduced into the way that we carry out science, as David mentioned in the 1660s, this was this idea that Boyle's original idea that you would read a scientific article and it would contain sufficient information that you would be able to redo the experiment yourself independently without needing to get into a dialogue with the original author to understand what was actually done. And part of the motivation was being able to verify the experiments and results that were being promulgated in the community at the time. Now, that concept has persisted through to today and touches on, in a sense, all the traditional types of research, the empirical types of research that we do in this community. I have a couple of examples I just pulled out that I think are interesting and illustrate the point. The first one on the left here is something, a commentary that appeared in Cell Reports in 2014, sorting out the facts. And the reason that I put this up here is just 2 pages. And this is a short report from a collaboration between Harvard and Berkeley, and they collaborated in their breast cancer research labs. And what they did is they put 2 months aside at the beginning of their grant, written into the proposal, to reconcile the processes in each lab so that the cells that came from the labs that they would be doing their research on did not contain any type of unique signature that would allow you to identify which lab had produced those cells. Seems quite straightforward, right? They're just going to reconcile their processes so that these cells matched. It took them 2 years. And what the article does is it talks about how hard it was to actually reconcile those empirical processes in the lab to end up with uniform output and results on which they could base their experiments. So what happened is, I'm not a biologist, I am a statistician, but what happened, in my understanding, my read of the article, is one lab had stirred a beaker at one point in the process. Another lab had put it in the centrifuge to do the stirring, and that had created those unique signatures. And neither lab thought that anyone would do it any other way. So it sort of took 2 years to kind of unpack. So it's an illustration of how difficult these reproducibility issues can be with very high integrity, well-intentioned researchers. This is a natural part of how we actually do discovery. On the right, I mentioned a National Academies roundtable that was from also 2014. And I just highlight this one, reproducibility issues in research with animals and animal models, to mention how when you think of reproducibility issues, we often think about this as a good thing in the sense of, if I can redo an experiment and confirm results, we've made scientific advances. And this is my belief. However, when you think about animals being involved in actually carrying out the experiment, who may be sacrificing their lives in the advance of science, it puts a new sort of lens on what it means to replicate an experiment and the costs that might be involved in doing the replication. So it's also an illustration of the different types of remedies and different types of lenses that we can bring to the problem of reproducibility that are very highly dependent on the context in which the research takes place. Okay. So different from empirical, what I'm calling empirical reproducibility, I also like to characterize statistical reproducibility. So these are, I just put a few sort of concerns here that may cause statistical findings not to replicate in a new sample. So things like false discovery, sort of looking through data to come up with hypotheses that you know you can confirm, for example, p-hacking, practices like this, carrying out experiments that have low power, poor experimental design, that just sort of, in a sense, make it very difficult for those, any results that you might obtain from that context to generalize or be reliable. Questions like, how have you done your data preparation or normalized your data, prepared it for analysis? What have you done with outliers and missing values? All that, how you've actually done the treatment of the data in preparation for your analysis. Small changes in how you treat outliers can sometimes have a very big impact on the results. So if the data are perturbed or your methods are slightly perturbed, how does that impact the findings that you originally drew from the data? What have you done in terms of the analysis itself? Have you used the appropriate models? Have you done the right types of statistical tests? Can we even sort of see what you've done in terms of the transparency of the reporting of all the statistics? So all of these aspects, I think, I like to sort of file them, in my mind, under statistical aspects that may cause results not to generalize to new samples or be less reliable than they might otherwise be. All active areas of research in many different fields, including statistics. I will mention, I believe this was under Marcia's watch, as she mentioned at Science at AAAS, this is an example of a remedy that goes to the statistical aspects of reproducibility. So in 2014, in January, Science instituted the requirement of several additional criteria in submitting articles to Science. So things like a data handling plan indicating how outliers are dealt with in your work, sample size estimation for effect size, so trying to get at these low power issues that I mentioned. Are you treating your samples randomly, and how much does the experimenter know about the experimental procedure as the actual work is unfolding? And statisticians were added to the board of reviewing editors as well for the work. So this to me is an example that goes to what I'm calling the statistical reproducibility aspects and highlights why, one of the reasons why it's important to distinguish these different types of reproducibility. So now we have empirical reproducibility, if you think about what's happening in the lab or at the bench, this is a canonical example, and statistical reproducibility. The final type of reproducibility, I think it is important to tease out and highlight as a separate source of your reproducibility, is computational reproducibility. So an example that I like to use is Google flu trends. So if we remember back to 2008, 2009, there was a huge amount of press and excitement about Google flu trends because what Google was able to do with their trends tool was predict flu outbreaks across the US faster than the Centers of Disease Control. And Centers of Disease Control are considered the gold standard because physicians will report their office visits and flu and so on back to the Centers of Disease Control, so they're considered kind of the gold standard of understanding how the disease is progressing around the US. So Google Flu Trends was able to do better and predict better, and it created, as you can see, a lot of press and so on. In 2013, Google Flu Trends was predicting more than double the proportion of doctor visits for flu than the CDC itself. Now, if you buy in that the CDC is the gold standard, that's a problem for Google Flu Trends. And if you go to the website today, it says, thank you for stopping by. We're no longer publishing current estimates of flu trends and so on. And the reason I raise this as an example of computational reproducibility issues, if you put aside the fact that Google's a proprietary company and has an extra incentive to keep methods closed that in the scientific community we may not have, but we didn't know why those predictions doubled. We actually, if we look back to 2008 when there were all this press around Google flu trends, we didn't know why they were doing a better job predicting. Somehow it was just enough that they were doing a better job and had proof of concept. So in my mind, computational reproducibility is about understanding and sort of blowing apart and shining light on those computational aspects of that data inference process. So we wouldn't do something like just tell people, here are my predictions. You would also accompany it with a clear explanation of how you got those predictions, so that when something like, the predictions start doubling, that's something that maybe we could have foreseen, or we can understand why it's doing that. Okay, so this comes from a couple of sources, and I'll take just a few minutes to tease this out because this is our newest aspect of reproducibility. Really, we've been grappling with computational aspects as a community for maybe 20 years, and in some communities, 10 years. This is all very new. So I identified three technological sources that impact how we can think about and understand computational reproducibility. Many of them I'm sure you're familiar with. Big data, new types of data, impacting the type of work and research we can actually do, enormous amounts of data that many communities now are taking on and using in exciting new science. That's accompanied with enormous increases in computational power. So we're able to do simulations of physical systems that we have been unable to do up until recently, asking new questions of, say, our cosmos, our environment, our world, through these types of simulation tools enabled by much faster machines than we've ever had before. The third one, I think, I don't see highlighted on the same level as the first two as changes, like when people are discussing changes in scientific research, but I think it's equally important. So going with big data, going with the big compute power, and the digitization of scientific research, we see an enormous amount of code being written to carry out the research. And this has the impact that scientific contributions, discoveries, methodologies, and improvements are now embedded in software and only in the software. So this is something that I think is also changing how we think about reproducibility and how we think about changes to how we carry out scientific research. So here are my claims. I believe virtually all published discoveries today have some computational component in what they're doing. So maybe it's something as small as running a statistical test using a statistical program, or something as large as carrying out full-scale simulations on a computational system. But this is something that's pervading all types of science that we do. So by the way, these three categories, computational reproducibility, empirical reproducibility, statistical reproducibility, certainly overlap. My second claim, that our traditional reporting standards are inadequate for computationally enabled research, which leads us to reproducibility concerns. So that goes to things like, am I able to see software and implementation of these methods? Am I able to fully understand that black box that produced, say, your flu trend prediction? Can we really open up and take a look at the computational aspects that drove the conclusions that are actually being published in the scholarly record? So in my mind, this is a very healthy, robust discussion about how the community responds to these new technological tools that are enabling so much more science and scientific discovery. Okay, so a quick frame on how I have found it useful to start thinking about the computational aspects. If we think about the scientific method, as David alluded to in the opening remarks, what makes science special and why we distinguish it from other types of activities that we might carry out, we've traditionally thought of two branches of the scientific method: our deductive branch, mathematics, formal logic, and our inductive branch, the controlled experimentation, hypothesis-driven analysis of controlled experiments. We have seen over the last 10, 15 years a lot of talk about third branch of the scientific method coming from those very high-powered simulations that I mentioned, fourth branch of the scientific method with data-driven discovery, and I snuck in a little question mark on branch 3 and 4 there, where I'm going to try to extend my previous remarks in a moment. So in 1995, so I just sort of grabbed these, there's many examples, there's nothing particular, these are just sort of exemplars, but in 1995 there was a NIST strategic planning workshop around modeling and simulation, and in the text there they say, in 1995, it's common now to consider computation as a third branch of science besides theory and experiment. On the other panel here, the fourth paradigm, this was an edited volume that came out in 2009, supported by Microsoft. And even in the, just the opening preface of the book, this book is about a new fourth paradigm for science based on data-intensive computing. So we have this recognition that there's something new afoot in how we're carrying out the research. So why do we have the scientific method? It's to address the ubiquity of error. Error creeps into everything we do in scientific research, everything we do as human beings, I'd like to argue. And the reason for the scientific method is we're trying to root error out of the process as much as we can and convince the community we've done the best we can to get things as right as possible. So the deductive branch, we're not publishing mathematical theorems without a proof. You're displaying your work in some sense. The empirical branch, we have an entire machinery of hypothesis testing, appropriate statistical methods, and a very structured way that you communicate your methods and the protocols that were used in the experiment to give you the results. You can't leave the methods section blank. So the claim is that computation, data science, these computationally enabled research that we're carrying out present potential third and fourth branches of the scientific method until we as a community develop comparable standards. That discussion is underway, but I highlight it as it's an ongoing discussion about how we actually incorporate computation as an instrument in our research and discovery process and reporting process. Okay, I'll just mention that there's a notion that goes back to 1992, so I want to also give homage to John Claerbout, who's an emeritus professor at Stanford, who identified this problem very early in the discussion. And he called it really reproducible research, with the idea being an article about computational science in a scientific publication is not the scholarship itself, it's advertising of the scholarship. The actual scholarship is your complete set of instructions and data, so all the code, all the data, all the information that actually generated the figures and the tables in the paper. Okay, so this is the last slide that I'll show you. So defining terms. So in discussions like one we're having today, my preference is to use modifiers like empirical reproducibility, computational reproducibility, statistical reproducibility. For some reason that I don't understand, there are every term that we use around reproducibility, nearly every term starts with R for some reason. So we have reproducibility, replicability, repeatability, robustness, reliability. Other concepts also play in here. Uncertainty quantification, really, how do we get our minds around a sense of where the errors are, where the uncertainty is in that discovery process? How does the computer start to play into that? So this is a robust field of research at the moment. Validity, verifiability, transparency. So the reason I like to use modifiers around reproducibility is many of these terms are already long established as terms of art in particular fields, often with very different definitions. So I don't advocate necessarily an agreement on these terms, particularly in light of where I started our brief discussion this morning, which is there's no one-size-fits-all solution, and different fields are implementing sort of reproducibility steps in their own way as they need to in their particular field. So I also wanted to mention, in the computational context, we can rerun an experiment on code and on data and check that we get the figures and tables in our paper. And that, although in a sense is reproducing the result, doesn't contribute to the sort of scientific validity of the result in the sense that an independent replication with supporting evidence and similar findings would do. So drawing that distinction, I think, is one that's actually quite important to mention. Okay. So my closing remarks, that we have a very, at least organizers and our impetus around this discussion was always very positive in the sense of addressing different aspects of how we do science, how we make the claims that we're deriving as robust or reliable as we can, and how do we build that sense of trust that Marcia mentioned, and continue that sense of trust that we have within the scientific community and also beyond the scientific community. So how do we carry out and communicate science in ways that reflect these modern interventions and especially the new tools that we have for carrying out research? So in sum, I am pleased to be here since I consider this a very healthy, robust, and productive discussion. So thank you.